Okay, so there are two forms of a quadratic equation, so we're going to look at those next. On this particular question, we have a quadratic that is in what we call vertex form. And we call it that because you can look at it directly and determine the vertex. So when I'm asked to find the vertex, your x value is always the opposite of whatever you're seeing with your x. So since I see minus 2, that means positive 2 is the x-coordinate of my vertex. And then the y value is directly what you see over here. So the y value would be negative 5. In order to find x-intercepts, you have to take that equation and you have to set it equal to 0, which is what I've done here. Notice I add 5 to both sides first. And then the way I get rid of this squared power, the opposite of that is to square root. And so by square rooting both sides, the square root cancels the square power here. And anytime I square root both sides, you have to consider that there are both positive and negative values that could give you that particular solution. So make sure you put the plus or minus. And then finally, to get x by itself, I had to add 2 on both sides. And as long as they tell me to write it as an ordered pair and they're not looking for a decimal, I can just leave it as in the form of 2 plus square root of 5 and 2 minus. And so this is what they look like when they're written as ordered pairs, remembering that the y value in both cases is 0. When they ask me to find 2 points on the graph, that's really up to me what x's that I want to choose. I just simply started with 3 for no particular reason. When I plug 3 into this original equation and simplify, I end up with 1 squared minus 5. That gives me negative 4. So that's one ordered pair. And then I just decided that I would plug in 4. So the only things you can't plug in would be your x-coordinate of your vertex or your x values of your intercepts. You want 2 other points. So you've got to choose x's other than those. When I plugged in the 4 minus 2, that left me with a 2. Then square it, minus 5. So 4 minus 5 left me with negative 1. So there's my second ordered pair. So now when I ask you to graph it, make sure that you show as many of those points as possible. So especially the vertex, which was at 2, negative 5. If you want to show these, I would suggest that you get on a calculator. They're approximately going to be, 4.2, 0 and something else. So you can, but if they're irrational like that, I don't necessarily have to see them. But definitely show these other points if you're not going to show the x-intercepts. So notice I showed you where 3, negative 4 would be, and then I showed you where 4, negative 1 would be. And because parabolas are symmetric, I went ahead and showed their mirror images over here just to make it easier for me to draw. So make sure you do connect your points and show me that you know it is a U-shaped curve. Now, the other form of a quadratic will look like this. And so in this case, there's a formula that you have to know in order to find your vertex. And that is this formula here. X is equal to the opposite of B divided by 2 times A. And so your B is always located in front of your X variable. In this case, my B is positive 3. This formula says I take the opposite of that. So notice I took negative 3. Your A is always in front of your squared term. And if there's nothing there, it is understood to be a 1 like I plugged in. So yeah, sometimes we do get fractions, leave them in fraction form. So in this case, my x-coordinate of my vertex is negative 3 over 2. I then have to take that and plug it back into the original function to find my y value. So that's what I did here, negative 3 over 2 squared, plus my 3 times negative 3 over 2, plus my 2. Now, as far as I'm concerned, you at least have to show me this step. But if you wanted to get on a calculator after that and punch out the rest, you certainly could. I went ahead and showed it all the way, just for those of you that are going to finish it out by hand. But again, if you punch it in a calculator, that's fine. But I've got to see this part. I've got to see what you did before you actually got on the calculator. Next part, finding the x-intercepts. Once again, we set the equation equal to 0. And in this case, we try to factor it. If it does, great. If it doesn't, you've got to do quadratic formula. This particular one does factor. Factors of positive 2 that add up to 3 would be 2 and 1. So I get these two factors, and then we set each factor individually equal to 0 and solve it. So one of my x-intercepts is at -2. The other x-intercept is at -1. So those would be the ordered pairs that represent those x-intercepts. And then finally, graphing it. So again, you'll probably want to go to decimals to know where to put that. So we know -3/2 is -1.5. And then if you divide 35 by 4, you're going to get an 8.8 approximately. And so that just kind of gives you an idea of where to put that starting point. And then I showed my x-intercepts at -2 and -1. Kind of a real tall, skinny parabola there. But once again, just make sure you then connect them as a U-shaped graph.